Welcome to a Pulp event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years, online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp event podcast, Nicholas Parisi, author of Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination, discusses the pulp influences on the classic television program, Twilight Zone. The talk was recorded on August 16, 2019, at PulpFest 2019 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Well, thanks everybody for sticking around, for coming. I guess it's somewhat appropriate that the Twilight Zone gets the latest presentation time of the night. So I wrote this here book about Rod Serling. I won't give you a sales pitch, just to give you very briefly what the book is about, because I think it is. Somebody just asked me, what is different about this book than the other dozen Twilight Zone books that have been written? Well, this is actually the first book that covers everything that Rod Serling ever wrote, not just the Twilight Zone. So it covers everything from his first television production in 1950 all the way through the Twilight Zone, and after the Twilight Zone all the way through Night Gallery. So it covers absolutely every single script that he wrote that was produced, and actually a whole bunch that weren't produced as well, including the films, a chapter on Planet of the Apes, etc. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about Rod Serling. I mean, I hope that you know a little bit about him, at least you know the Twilight Zone, but to give you some of his biography, I mean, Rod Serling was born on Christmas Day, 1924, in Binghamton, New York, upstate New York. And, I'm sorry, he was born in Syracuse, New York. I guess I'm wrong. He was born in Syracuse, New York, but they moved to Binghamton when he was not even 2 years old. So he spent his formative years in Binghamton. And Binghamton was his hometown, and he came to love his hometown. He adored his memories of Binghamton, of when he was a boy there. Primarily because the day after high school graduation in 1942, he shipped off to war. He volunteered for the Army the day after graduation, and he became a paratrooper. And he saw some pretty heavy combat in the Philippines, in Leyte and Luzon. He was 18 years old when he joined, barely 18 years old. He joined in January of 43 and turned 18 in December of 42. And he was 5'4" tall, weighed 118 pounds. And months later, he's fighting in the jungles of the Philippines, virtually. So, just like any other combat veteran, he came back scarred from this. This was with him for the rest of his life. It was traumatic, to say the least. And when he came back, it made him yearn for that innocence of his childhood in Binghamton that much more. That innocence that he would never recapture again. And this kind of thing showed up all the time in the Twilight Zone and elsewhere in his work. Probably my favorite Twilight Zone episode, Walking Distance, is the most famous example of this, about a burned out New York City executive who just wants to go back, just wants to get on a carousel again and eat cotton candy and taste that innocence again. And that was Rod Serling. That was Rod Serling reaching back and taking us along for the ride with him and saying, this is what I wish I could do. So Rod Serling came back from the war. He went to school in Yellow Springs, Ohio, at Antioch College in Yellow Springs. And he started to write. And he started to write primarily as a means to deal with some of that trauma from the war. He very explicitly said it. I became a writer to get it out of my gut, to put it on paper. And that's what he started to write about, was about his war experiences were the first things. But as Mike had mentioned, when he was growing up, he and his brother loved the pulps. They loved comic books, they read comic books, they loved imaginative movies. Probably his favorite movie of all time was King Kong. He and his brother would say that King Kong was like, it was like the stop everything kind of movie. Whatever they were doing, if King Kong was on TV, you stop what you're doing and go watch King Kong. They would watch it every time it was ever on TV. So he loved imaginative fiction. This may be a bit of an unknown thing about Rod Serling, because a lot of people see him as, he was not publishing in the pulps. He did not write short stories for Amazing Stories or Amazing Fantasy and Science Fiction or Beyond or anything else. The other writers for the Twilight Zone did, but Rod Serling did not. And he started as a television writer, and he wrote straight drama until the Twilight Zone began essentially. So there was kind of this conception that Rod Serling was not a science fiction guy, but he loved science fiction. He loved science fiction and fantasy and horror from the time he was a kid. And he always wanted to do a show like The Twilight Zone. But in television, in 1950, 51, 52, all the way to 59, science fiction just was not what the serious dramatic writer was expected to write. It just wasn't. It wasn't done. It was looked down upon. It was looked as it was something for kids. It was not something a serious writer would waste his time doing. And there's a very famous interview of Rod Serling with Mike Wallace that's been released on Twilight Zone DVD collections, and it's been used in other in Rod Serling biographies and stuff, where Mike Wallace says to Rod Serling straight out, says, well, you're going to be spending so much time working on this Twilight Zone that I guess you've given up writing anything important for television. And that was the common wisdom at the time. He'd given up writing anything important for television because he was writing science fiction now. So Rod Serling, again, just to for anybody who doesn't know, Rod Serling was clearly, without question, the most prestigious and the most honored and the most celebrated writer in television before The Twilight Zone debuted. The Twilight Zone debuted October 2nd, 1959. By that time, Rod Serling was at the top of the heap. He had won 3 consecutive Emmy Awards for Best Dramatic Writing in 1955, 56, and 57. He had been a star, literally a star, from the time that a show called Patterns aired. Patterns aired on the Kraft Theater in January of 1955, and it literally made Rod Serling a star overnight. And this is something that it's maybe a little bit tough to explain to people. Like, how could one television show make a writer a star? What's the big deal? Well, at the time, live television. We're talking about live television in the early 50s. It was like the opening of a Broadway show. And just as a Broadway show can open and a bad review or a bunch of bad reviews could kill it. It could be closed by the end of the week. And great reviews can set it off on a course to stay, in production for a long time. Well, the same thing with a TV show. And when the reviews came out for Patterns the day after it aired, they were like nothing television had ever seen before. The critic for the New York Times essentially, literally said it was the best thing he'd ever seen on television from the standpoint of writing, directing, acting. It was the best thing he'd ever seen produced for television. And so Rod Serling's famous line was, well, the moment that show went off the air, my phone started ringing, and it's never stopped since. And that was essentially true. So that made him a star. He followed it up with Recommend for a Heavyweight just about basically the following year, and that confirmed his status. Then he happened to win a third Emmy Award the next year for a show called The Comedian on Playhouse 90, which is an adaptation. And so he was set. And when he had this name for himself, he built up this prestige, and CBS said, well, you can create a show for us now. Well, what do you want to do? Well, he went back to the Pulps. He went back to his roots, and he said, well, I've always wanted to do this science fiction show. And oh, by the way, you've probably heard that he had a lot of trouble with the sponsors and the network executives over controversial subject matter in dramas that he was doing. He always got pushback from these people whenever he tried to address anything relevant in straight drama. And so this was kind of a have your cake and eat it too kind of thing. He got to do what he really wanted to do, which was science fiction. And also, oh, by the way, maybe I'll be able to get away with some of this stuff that I've been trying so hard to address in straight drama because they're not going to pay much attention to me in science fiction. And it worked beautifully. Now, that's my theory. There's been a lot written and a lot said about Rod Serling's ability to use science fiction and fantasy as a way to address these subjects through allegory and through metaphor. And I think that is somewhat true, but I think the other part of that is that it wasn't so much that it was allegory, it was just that it was science fiction. And as I said before, when it was looked down upon, there were people who just were dismissive of science fiction in general, so they just weren't going to pay that much attention to it. So it wasn't so much that they didn't get it, sometimes they did, a lot of times they did. But it was also that once the spaceships show up, they just, they turn off their brains and they don't watch it. The famous example I'll give you on that is, 6 months into the series, and again, I'll go back to that Mike Wallace interview for a second. If you've never seen the Mike Wallace interview, you can find it on YouTube, and it's definitely worth watching. But during this interview, Rod Serling specifically says, I'm not going to make any waves here. I'm not going to, touch any controversial subject matter. I'm going to play nice with this, this show. Don't worry about it, And then 6 months later, he airs an episode called The Monsters of New on Maple Street. One of the best episodes, one of the best half hours in television history. And this episode ends with Rod Serling's narration at the end of the episode saying, there are weapons that do not come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, prejudices, attitudes to be found only in the minds of men. And I won't finish it for you, but it was Rod Serling specifically saying, I'm talking about you guys. I'm reaching through the TV. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about you. We have these prejudices. We have these thoughts that can be deadly. And he didn't get any pushback on this. He didn't get any pushback from the sponsors and the networking. Why? I mean, he was even specifically. This wasn't allegory. This was Rod Serling saying, the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone. That was the end of it. I mean, he specifically says, I'm not talking about the Twilight Zone here, I'm talking about our place, And he got away with it. Why? Because, as I said, I believe that, at least to some extent, that once that spaceship shows up at the end of Monsters on Maple Street and the aliens are talking about Earth, it's like, what is this? I don't get it. Let's just forget this. They dismissed it. And he was able to get away with it that way. So, that's the Twilight Zone. So yes, he absolutely had a pulp background, at least in terms of his, the things that he liked. But again, he was not a writer for the pulps. Now, Rod Serling did something very, very smart when he, began the Twilight Zone. Nobody could write every episode of a series, and he came about as close as he possibly could. He wrote 92 episodes of 156 in 5 seasons. 70 of them were originals, 22 were adaptations. But the smart thing he did was he brought along Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson, and eventually George Clayton Johnson as well, and Earl Hamner. But those guys, of course, had a history in the pulps. They were working writers. They wrote for every magazine under the sun, particularly Beaumont and Matheson, really. So they had that history with the pulps, and and the rest is history, so to speak. So I'm going to show you some, I had a video that unfortunately is not going to play, but the video that, let's see, this video right here that won't actually play, I'll just show you this sitting there. He basically says, listen, the beauty of it, when they first did the Twilight Zone, the beauty of it was that I had this gold mine of untouched material that had never been done on television before. Nobody had ever gone into these magazines and got these great stories that, that could be done. I mean, yes, there were science fiction shows before the Twilight Zone. There was, Tales of Tomorrow and science fiction theater, but nothing like the Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone was revolutionary on television, especially in a fantasy sense, not even so much in a science fiction sense, but fantasy in this regard, in this way, had not been done on television. So what he says is, they've been printed in magazines and books over and over again, but they had never been done on television. So we had just this gold mine to pick from. And as I said, Serling wrote 70 originals, but he wrote 22 adaptations, and then other people wrote adaptations as well. So probably this may be the earliest, source that went to Weird Tales 1939. The Valley was still, this turned into an episode called Still Valley, Manly Wade Wellman. It's an episode about the Civil War, where a Confederate soldier gets a hold of a spell book that can maybe win the Civil War for the South, and he decides that, we're going to sell our souls to the devil if we use this book to win the war, and I'd rather we lose the war than lose our souls, essentially. And Serling adapted that one. Unknown Worlds. This is Blind Alley. This was a 4th season episode of Late I Think of Cliffordville. It's a time travel story. Rod Serling loved time travel in general. From the standpoint of being able to go back to those earlier, simpler times, it was one reason he liked it, because I could go, vicariously go back in time through my characters. But he just liked time travel in general. And if you don't know, the fourth season of the Twilight Zone, they were hour-long episodes, and they're generally viewed as inferior to the half-hour episodes. But and this was one of the middle-of-the-road ones, I think, for the fourth season. Astounding, and one of the things that I realized, going through some of these magazines, talk about a golden age of science fiction. I mean, you'll see how many different titles are here, how many different magazines that these came from. There's 24, and it's amazing. It's across the board. Nowadays it's tough to keep a science fiction magazine in business essentially for too long. But back then, God, it's just amazing. But this one, What You Need, was actually done on Tales of Tomorrow. They actually adapted it for that show first, and then Serling got a hold of it and did it for the Twilight Zone. A good episode about a guy who can basically tell somebody what they need and sell. He's a peddler and can sell them, a pair of scissors that they're going to need because they're going to get this scarf caught in the elevator on the way down, and they can cut themselves free and that kind of thing. So that was one of them. Galaxy. Now here we get into Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson wrote some of the best Twilight Zone episodes, as did Charles Beaumont, as did Rod Serling. Matheson, the very first issue, the debut issue of Galaxy Science Fiction, October of 1950, that has a story by Matheson called Third from the Sun. Now, Third from the Sun is interesting because, and I'm going to spoil all sorts of endings tonight, so if you've never seen these episodes, you've never read the stories, I'm sorry. The show is 60 years old this year, I'm going to spoil them all. Third from the Sun is about a group of people, a family essentially, who they know that there's going to be a nuclear war on the planet, there's going to be a devastating war on the planet, and they've got to get off. They want to get off the planet and escape. So they do. They get off and they take a spaceship and they escape the planet, and it turns out that the planet they're going to is Earth. And it's not, they come from Earth, they're going to Earth. Now that twist ending, this is October of 1950, that was, it was new at the time. That was a great twist ending at the time. That twist ending became like the dreaded cliche for science fiction editors everywhere. I mean, I go through the slush pile and you'd find 10 stories where it turns out that they're going to Earth instead of coming from, it just became a really, and you can think of other examples of where that happened. But I still find people to this day that watch that episode like, oh, they think that's the greatest twist ending ever. Why don't we talk about that ending so much? Well, because it's been done 3,000 times, that's why. And then the following month, so we got back-to-back months issues. The next month is Damon Knight's To Serve Man, which is the greatest twist ending of all time. Long before the Twilight Zone debuted, at least a year before the Twilight Zone debuted, Ted Sturgeon, recommended To Serve Man to Serling and said, you got to read this ending, you're going to love it, and he was right. Serling, of course, adapted it, and he adapted it beautifully. This is an example where Serling really, really enhanced the story. I mean, it's a great story, don't get me wrong. But the way it's told, to me, in that Twilight Zone episode, the flashback, with the narration at the beginning and the end, the characters on the ship, on the way to the Canamit's planet, and at the end he's saying, hey, he breaks the fourth wall and talks to the audience, hey, are you on the ship yet, or maybe you're going to be an ingredient in somebody's soup, that was, and Damon Knight loved the episode. He said it made him a big star at home, it was one of those things. And I should probably point out right here that this is another thing you would have heard from that video clip, is that Rod Serling had so much respect for the science fiction writers who were publishing in the pulps. He bowed to them that they were the real science fiction writers. He never considered himself a real science fiction writer. And Rod Serling was, in case, again, if you don't know this, Rod Serling was his own harshest critic. He never gave himself a break on anything. He just killed himself about even his best work. Even his best work, he would find something to criticize in it. And so when it came to this, he was very, very humble. He would never put himself on the level of a Ray Bradbury or anybody else, or Heinlein Sturgeon, anybody, in terms of being a science fiction writer. What he did take credit for, rightly, was that he made it palatable on television. He was the one who brought it to television and made it and put it in a form that the mass audience could understand. And that's a presentation for another time, how he did that. But yeah, so back-to-back issues, 2 classic Twilight Zone episodes there. And then we get to Charles Beaumont. And I understand there'll be the Charles Beaumont documentary after this. September 1952. You know, people in general, especially the laymen, they look at science fiction in general as being predictive. You know, they think, like when you set a story in the year 2020 and it doesn't actually come to happen, like you made a mistake. Like you're supposed to be predicting things, and that's overstated. Science fiction is not about predicting things. Is in some cases it's a way of saying if we go on this way, this might happen, but it's not about predicting things. But Charles Beaumont's The Beautiful People, which was produced as number 12 Looks Just Like You, is about as prophetic as a Twilight Zone episode could get. This is an astoundingly prophetic episode. It's about, I'm going to run it for you. It's about a future society where everyone has to undergo plastic surgery, a form of plastic surgery to ensure mass conformity. And everybody's beautiful in this society. Everybody looks the same. They all have, they're all perfect. And I watched this episode today, and it's as relevant now as it was, 60 years ago. Pretty amazing. Again, another different magazine if you want to science fiction. Amazing stories, of course. This was 2 different Beaumont episodes, back to 51 and then 57. Well, actually, no, 1 Beaumont, 1 Matheson. Little Girl Lost from October, November 53. Little Girl Lost, one of the more famous Twilight Zone episodes about the little girl Tina who rolls off the bed and rolls into another dimension. They just happen to know a physicist who knows how to get her back from inside the wall. And The Devil You Say is actually one of the better 4th season 1-hour-long episodes starring Burgess Meredith. It's called Printer's Devil on Twilight Zone. It's about a newspaper editor who is visited by Satan, and he can make him a successful newspaper editor by predicting the future. And he makes the future happen, of course, and gives them the scoops on what's going to happen. I think that's actually one of the better hour-long episodes. Yet another title, Fantastic Adventures. Brothers Beyond the Void, Serling adapted that one as People Are Alike All Over, with Roddy McDowell. Marcus said, "You were right, people are alike all over," where he ends up in the zoo. That's, the Martians look like us, but they put them in essentially a cage, and that's how people are alike all over. Generally speaking, when Rod Serling adapted a short story, he was pretty faithful to the original short story. There's one I didn't get to yet that he was not faithful at all to, but generally he was pretty faithful. This one he changed a couple of characters around, he gave some characteristics to Marcus and that Conrad had in the story, and vice versa. But he was pretty faithful to this particular story. Magazine Fantasy and Science Fiction. Now this is the one where this was actually the first story that Serling bought from Richard Matheson. When Matheson first started selling stories to Serling, he would sell the story, and Serling would adapt it. He didn't write his own stuff for Twilight Zone initially, and I think he said that he was kind of like iffy on doing his own stuff at the time. He didn't want to do his own short story on his Twilight Zone. He'd rather give him an original screenplay. If he was going to do a short story, he'd let Serling do it. I already wrote it as a short story. You read it as a TV show. But this one, Disappearing Act, it was adapted as When the Sky Was Open, an excellent first season episode that has almost nothing to do with Richard Matheson's story. It takes just a kernel of the story and spins it into a totally different way, and to the point that Richard Matheson actually said, "I don't even know why he paid me for it. He just could have written his own episode. Why bother?" But it's about Richard Matheson's story is about a man who finds that his friends are disappearing. His friends, his wife, his people around him are just disappearing, and nobody remembers them. Nobody remembers. I'm the only one who remembers these people. What happened? And Serling took it and made it a space. More of a science fiction show where these astronauts come back from a mission, and there's 3 of them, and suddenly one disappears, and the other 2, nobody remembers the 3rd guy. And then the 2nd guy disappears, and they say, "No, there's a solo mission. What are you talking about? Whatever these other 2 guys." And then by the end, the 3rd guy disappears, and And it's one of the more ambiguous Twilight Zone endings. They never explain, really why these people are disappearing. It's just kind of implied that, something went wrong and they weren't supposed to come back. And so the universe is just wiping them out. It's a really excellent commentary on the fears of going into space back in 1959, 60. Imagination, another title. Two more Beaumonts. Beaumont was publishing in everywhere. Eventually, he started publishing for Playboy almost exclusively, and he was as successful a short story writer as you could be at the time, really. And he wrote some of the best Twilight Zone episodes. He had Elegy, 1953. The Man Who Made Himself was another fourth season episode in his image. Another title, Beyond. Sorry, Right Number was adapted fifth season Night Call. Richard Matheson did not write many stories in the fifth season. For whatever reason, the producer of the fifth season was different than the other seasons, and he just didn't like Matheson's stuff because he's a dope. But I guess I don't get it. But so Matheson didn't have much in the fifth season. But this was one of the creepier Twilight Zones. Talk about scary Twilight Zone. People, we can argue about what the scariest Twilight Zone episode is. Everybody seems to be freaked out by something different. This is an episode that got me when I was a kid. This is about an old woman who's in in her deathbed essentially, and she starts getting these freaky, creepy calls from somebody, and it turns out they're coming from her dead husband, and they find the telephone line is lying on his grave. I mean, it's just, that's definitely one of the scarier episodes. Back to Beaumont, The Jungle. The Jungle is, 1954. The Jungle is one of the more underrated episodes, I think. I like this one. People, from what I gather, I think people don't like this one quite as much as I do. This was starring John Denner. It's about a guy who, he's a businessman, and they kind of pillaged a village in Africa, and the superstitions come back to, they follow him to New York, basically, and at the end his wife gets eaten by a lion. I mean, they don't show it, of course, but that's obviously what happens. Another pretty scary episode. I mean, there are sequences in this episode where he's running from nothing. He just hears drums, and he sees strange things, and he's it's a pretty creepy one. Infinity Science Fiction, again, I lost count. Is probably like the 8th or 9th different science fiction magazine. Perchance to Dream. Perchance to Dream was the first Charles Beaumont scripted episode of the series. Perchance to Dream is about a guy who goes to a psychiatrist to tell him that he's been having this recurring nightmare about a woman who's luring him onto a roller coaster, and he's got a heart condition, and the nightmare freaks him out so bad that he feels like he's going to have a heart attack and die, so he doesn't want to go back to sleep. So when he first goes to the psychiatrist, he'll wait for 72 hours, he won't go to sleep. And when Charles Beaumont wrote this episode, the screenplay, not the story, but the teleplay, he said, I never expected it to go on the air as it was written. Rod Serling told me, write it the way you see it, and don't worry about the little old lady in Dubuque, she'll get it, she doesn't get enough credit, she knows she can understand it, and you can do it the way you want it. And Beaumont said, I just assumed he was just screwing with me, he's not gonna use it the way I wrote it. Well, it went on verbatim, not a word was changed. And from that moment on, Beaumont, realized what he was dealing with here. He was really dealing with a different show. This was a show that was going to respect the writers, and it was also going to respect the intelligence of the audience, that was, unheard of at the time. Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, 1956. There's an episode called Steel, or a short story called Steel, also the episode called Steel, starring Lee Marvin. It was a robot boxing episode where Lee Marvin, they have robot boxing in the future because boxing has been outlawed. And it was loosely the inspiration for the Hugh Jackman movie Real Steel. I think Matheson got some credit for that. It's a fifth season episode. Some people love, Matheson. This is probably Matheson's probably his favorite of the ones that were done from his episodes. I'm not a huge fan of this one, but it certainly has its fans. Hitchcock's mystery magazine. This is Price Day, a writer that wouldn't have, not a famous writer by any stretch. 4 o'clock. Rod Serling adapted that one, starring Theodore McKell. Not one of the better Twilight Zone episodes, but one reason I wanted to show this was because one of the things I think people miss about the Twilight Zone, especially in the remakes, umpteenth remakes that have been done, is that the Twilight Zone was not only science fiction, fantasy, and horror, but it was noir. It always had a touch of noir, even in the science fiction and fantasy episodes. So it did reach into mystery magazines like Hitchcock. In the Twilight Zone, 1959 and 1964, the men wore hats. They smoked all the time. They drank all the time. It was noir. The characters it was black and white, obviously. It had that noir sensibility to it, and that's completely missing from every attempt to remake the series since then. That's my last slide. So listen, the pulp roots of the Twilight Zone obviously are there. They had, as Rod Serling said in the clip that I couldn't play you, they had this gold mine of short stories to draw from, and they drew from it pretty much continuously, whether Serling was adapting them, or whether Beaumont was adapting his own stories, or whether Matheson was adapting his own stories, or whatever. They had these stories to draw from. They've been released. You can get the Twilight Zone, the original stories, in a collection that has all the original stories that were eventually turned into Twilight Zone episodes, and there are other collections as well. But so, if you have any questions about Rod Serling, let me just tell you also, I didn't mention, but I'm also a member of the board of directors of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. We're a charity that helps to preserve and promote Rod Serling's legacy. And as this is the 60th anniversary of the Twilight Zone, we're actually having a convention this year called Serling Fest in Binghamton, New York, Rod Serling's hometown, October 4th, 5th, and 6th. The actual anniversary is the 2nd. And it's going to be a 3-day event of just a celebration of the Twilight Zone. This is actually going to be the 3rd year we were doing it. The prior 2 years we've covered everything that's Serling related. This year will be 90% of the Twilight Zone. And it also happens to be the 50th anniversary of Night Gallery's debut in November of '69. So we're going to be screening Night Gallery and then doing that. And there's going to be, at last count, 11 different writers who have written really substantial books about Serling, Twilight Zone, whatever, who are going to be there. So if you go to rodserling.com, you can get information about that. But yes, please.
Do you favor Twilight Zone over Night Gallery or vice versa?
Very, very much so. He favored the Twilight Zone and Night Gallery. He had a very, very contentious relationship with the Night Gallery series, particularly with the producer of Night Gallery, named Jack Laird. Jack Laird was the producer of Night Gallery, and he was, to my research, the only person in Rod Serling's entire career that he didn't get along with. Rod Serling got along with everybody. He really did. He was a people person. He was gregarious, he was personable, he was, he liked people. And he and Jack Laird just butted heads from day one. Literally from the moment they met, they didn't get along. And not only did they not get along personally, but Jack Laird was not a huge fan of Rod Serling as a writer. And believe it or not, he just wasn't. And to be fair to Jack Laird, to some extent, he's put in a strange position because he was basically given the reins of that series. You say, hey, this is your series to produce. It's called Rod Serling's Night Gallery, but you're the producer, and oh, by the way, the head writer is a guy you're not a big fan of, And so he was in a weird position. But Jack Laird was not a people person. Rod Serling was, and Jack Laird did not handle Rod Serling well at all. So they butted heads constantly. And the problem with Night Gallery was that Rod Serling didn't have any say in the creative process of Night Gallery. He wrote for it, but that was it. And after he wrote it, they could do what they wanted. He could be rejected. He had no say in cast, no say in director, no say in production values, nothing. So he was continuously frustrated with that series. Now, having said that, I point out in the book that I think Rod Serling wrote some of his absolute best stuff for Night Gallery. There are a couple of episodes of Night Gallery that I put up there with anything else that Rod Serling wrote. particularly an episode called The Messiah on Mott Street, which is my favorite Night Gallery episode about an old Jewish man who is trying to stay alive for his grandson, and they're just all they have for each other, and just about is literally about them trying to stay alive for each other. It's just a beautiful story. That's one of his best pieces of work. So he wrote some great stuff for it, but the problem with Night Gallery was that again, he didn't have any control of anything else really, and he really, and I agree with him on this, he hated those little vignettes that they would do, like in between episodes. They might have like a 3-minute, usually comedic kind of sketch, and those were completely Jack Laird's idea, and I think they're just pointless too. And then he thought they just ruined the tone of the show, and I do agree with him on that. So, but again, having said that, there's a lot of really great Night Gallery episodes. Yeah. Sure.
Okay, I got a question for you, but first I'm going to make a comment that partly addresses her question. And I'm going to praise you, although I'm going to violently disagree with you on one thing.
Okay.
Please. I walked up to this guy's table and I thought, okay, here's another guy exploiting Rod Serling in a media thing, and okay, I've already read one biography of Serling, and I've read a bunch of Twilight Zone books, and here's another guy ripping them off. And I started talking to this guy, and I realized he understood the Pulps. He understood Serling. He understood TV history. He was the first person ever to not just say, well, Serling and Laird didn't get along, but he told me why, and he went into some detail, and he made a statement. Most of everything he said I agreed with, except one thing I partly disagreed with. And I was really impressed by the guy, and I've been walking around with a budget, and I've been saying to everybody, okay, I'm thinking about buying the book. I'm going to buy this guy's book. And I really got it.
I didn't pay him for any of this, I swear.
But okay, and the thing is, nobody can ever explain the thing about Laird and Serling. But here's the thing. For years I had read Frederick Paul's story. Frederick Paul, the great science fiction author, editor, and agent, who had said he once talked to a guy in Hollywood who did a lot of science fiction. He didn't say whether the guy was a screenplay writer or an agent or a producer or whatever, but he said that he talked to the guy, and the guy pointed to a whole bunch of science fiction magazines on the wall, and he said, if I need something, I just go up there and pull it out of there. And in 1991, my first convention ever, my first Worldcon ever, there was a convention autographing session, and there was Fred Paul, and I walked up to him, and I gave him the book to sign, and I told him the story, and I said, okay, who was it you talked to? And he wouldn't say. And I thought maybe it was some hack like Irwin Allen or Sid Pink or some character like that, or maybe it was even Roddenberry, Gene Roddenberry. But it just occurred to me that, oh shit, it wasn't Rod Serling, was it? Do you think there was any possibility it was Serling?
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, Rod Serling, he always gave credit where it was due.
All right.
Yeah,
that would imply it wasn't, because Serling did, and Serling obviously loved the stuff.
Yeah.
And for that reason, like I was saying, you have the multidisciplinary view. I mean, you understand the Pulps, you can show us the Pulp covers, you can tell us the stories, the author, you can tell us the Beaumont thing and the thing with Laird. I was always impressed by how Serling loved the Pulps, drew from them, unlike Bill Gaines at EC Comics, who ripped off Bradbury and had to be gently blackmailed by Bradbury into admitting it and paying him. This guy would pay the people and hire them.
Right.
So,
well, I'll give you. I'll cut you down because I should at least address to some extent the Bradbury-Serling dynamic, because Bradbury and Serling were, keyword were, very good friends. They were very close friends. I mean, their families went on vacation together. They were very good friends. And then Bradbury started accusing Serling of plagiarism.
oh really?
Yes.
That's ironic, because he played the game with Gaines where he said, yeah, I'm really flattered that you're using my stuff. Maybe you should credit it and pay me too.
Yeah. And with Serling, it was completely behind his back that Serling would start hearing things. Hey, Bradbury was into something, and guess what? You stole his story about, you know, and they had a pretty contentious exchange of letters where Serling said essentially what I said. Hey, you know, you had dinner at my house, and you can't come to me and say this to my face. You have to go, you know, behind my back to say this stuff. So they were not friends for the rest of their life. And Bradbury never sued him. And I mean, in one of the letters, Serling essentially says, "Hey, Ray, sue me. You really think I stole your story? Sue me." And he never did. So I really, and listen, I love Bradbury. Okay, I mean, everybody loves Bradbury, and he's written some of my favorite short stories, my favorite novels. However, I think he really treated Serling badly, and especially from the standpoint that Bradbury was the king. I mean, he was the king of this group of writers, this Beaumont Matheson included, and he really could have welcomed Serling into the group. Again, Serling did not publish short stories in these pulps. He was not a short story writer, he wasn't a novelist. And he really was coming at it as an outsider. And Bradbury could have really kind of welcomed him in as an outsider, said, hey, you're one of us. And instead he did take the opposite tack. He said that, and again, this is completely my opinion, you know, nobody else's, but I think he was jealous. Bradbury had a series that was being pitched right before the Twilight Zone. It was called Ray Bradbury's To the Moon and Back, or something to do with the moon. And it didn't sell, and Rod Serling's did.
Do you talk about that in the book?
That series I don't know. The Bradbury series I don't. But yeah, and then Rod Serling, all of a sudden, this outsider comes in and becomes the science fiction king and starts being compared to Bradbury. And I think Bradbury was jealous, I really do. And so does Robert Serling, actually. He mentioned he had the same opinion too, as his brother, but yeah.
Well, in any event, I just want to say that I think you really are the first person to bring it all together, because TV people talk about TV, pulp people talk about pulp, science fiction, non-pulp talk about science fiction. You seem to have brought everything together, and I think I think Serling was like to science fiction authors and TV what John W. Campbell had been to science fiction authors.
I think that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
Magazines, and I guess you answered
What Rod Serling did was, and there's another presentation I do about this particularly, but what Rod Serling did was he really made science fiction and fantasy, particularly fantasy, accessible to the mainstream audience on television. When this show debuted in 1959, 18 million people watched that debut episode. You got to figure 17 million of them had never read magazine of fantasy and science fiction. You know, they just didn't. So Rod Serling had to teach these people what fantasy was all about, and I mean that literally. Again, there's a different presentation for another time, but he did that. He actually taught people the tropes. He taught people what fantasy was all about on television. And every science fiction show and fantasy show that come afterward owes a gigantic debt to Rod Serling for doing that. Not only for doing that, but for also raising the bar for the quality of these shows, because that's what the show was. The show was, it took this ghetto genre of science fiction and treated it like it was a quality presentation, that it was highbrow, and nobody had done it before Rod Serling did.
One last question. Do you do, or did the person who made that slide do 3D photography?
I don't, but I did this, but no, I don't do that. Yeah.
Because freakishly, I do 3D photography,
Yeah,
and I can preview stereograms without a viewer, both on slides and prints, and that is, if anybody else in the audience can preview stereo,
Maybe.
you look at those pictures, it isn't just that one is wider than the other. It is an astonishing 3D stereogram.
Maybe,
if you can put the two together.
Did you have the bottle? They took the bottle from Tammy, please. One last one, I think.
Go ahead.
Okay, very quickly, I have read the book. I'm probably on the second round of it. I do want to thank you for writing it. And Anne Serling wrote the foreword.
I should have mentioned
And
this.
she mentioned that you brought up things that she wasn't aware of. I was just curious, do you have an example, or should we?
I think she was primarily talking about particular shows that I uncovered. That's one thing I'll end up with this, is that this book really started very, very simply. I wanted to get a complete list, just a list. I wanted to get a complete list of everything that Rod Serling wrote that was produced. And believe it or not, every list that that was out there was incomplete. They all had things missing or mistakes or whatever. Even, IMDb was missing things. And so I wanted to get a complete list, and I uncovered probably half a dozen things that Rod Serling wrote that had not been included on any of his bibliographies. So yeah, as Serling was saying, I never heard of the show. I never heard of the show. So there's a bunch of stuff like that, yeah, that she had never heard of. So, but
for the Twilight Zone on CBS, they do the reruns now. It's Cuba Productions. Ithaca.
yeah.
What's the connection with Serling to Ithaca? Did he live there for a while?
Oh yeah. He had a cabin on Cayuga Lake, and they still have it. The family has these 3 cabins actually on Cayuga Lake, and the family still owns them. So he would go back there every summer. They would spend on Cayuga Lake, and he taught at Ithaca College for many years. And Ithaca College is one of the archives of the Serling material that I did visit for some of my research.
I went to school with this now. I went to school with this now.
Oh really? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Because Binghamton are not, they're fairly close
Yeah.
to each other as well.
Yeah.
How did you get along with Desilu?
He got along with Desilu just fine. They only did the one show. They did the Time Element, which now is kind of considered the unofficial Twilight Zone pilot. And that's a good story. That the Desilu story about that. But they have a very instrumental place in Twilight Zone history. Without them, maybe it goes a different way, because they aired what really was the Twilight Zone pilot called the Time Element. And I'm sorry if anybody knows the story.
You're way out of time.
I'm way over. I'm way over time. Is that it? Okay. Well, all right. I'll tell you the Time Element story real quick. The Twilight Zone was originally pitched. The first time Rod Serling pitched it was called The Twilight Zone: The Time Element, and it was a time travel story about a guy who thinks he's going back in time to the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he's trying to convince people that there's going to be this attack, and of course nobody believes him. Well, he submitted this script to CBS, and they rejected it as a pilot because they just thought the ending was too ambiguous. Again, the mainstream viewers are going to get this. They're not savvy enough. They're not going to understand it. Well, Desilu Playhouse bought it. They liked it. The producer liked it, and Desi Arnaz liked it. And they loved Rod Serling, and they wanted to do it. So they said, all right, we'll do it. And they did, and it got more positive viewer mail than anything else that Desilu had ever done. And CBS, woke up and said, oh yeah, maybe that Twilight Zone idea is pretty good. Let's try and push that forward. So they moved forward with the Twilight Zone series, and yeah, so his relationship with them was just fine. And the funny thing is, Desi Arnaz's daughter, Desi and Lucy's daughter, Lucy Arnaz, she never knew until decades later. She never knew the connection between her father and the Twilight Zone. And she says she loved the Twilight Zone. They would watch it all the time. They watched it together all the time when she would visit them on weekends. And she said never once did he turn to her and say, hey, without me, that show might never took credit for anything. But yeah, so all right. Thank you.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2019.